There's a problem with how many tutorials show you how to do form validation in JavaScript. It's not that those other tutorials are bad or giving you wrong information, it's just that they don't show you how to do two things. The first thing is they tend to show you how to grab the values from an HTML form and check if they're required or meet a particular length, for example, but they only show you how to apply this to a single HTML form at a time. This means you're going to be writing the same JavaScript form validation code for every single form that you create, and even modifying an existing form means you're updating your validation logic. Good code is supposed to be reusable. The second thing is other tutorials usually run detached from the HTML form. What I mean by this is even though the JavaScript code you end up writing references the HTML form so that the values from the input elements can be accessed, that's where the connection ends. There's no use of the built-in 5 HTML validation attributes, which really your JavaScript form validation code should be complementing, and if you do want to use some of the browser's validation, you'll be adding your validation rules in two places. We're going to address these issues in this tutorial by creating some useful, reusable and flexible JavaScript functions which you can use to validate any HTML form you write for your web content. Not only will the validation code we write be reusable, but it will also build upon existing HTML5 form validation, so this will improve the look and feel of how the built-in validation looks. But if JavaScript has been disabled for whatever reason, the default browser validation will still kick in. We'll be building the HTML form from scratch, including all the styling, so if you're just interested in the validation of the form, feel free to skip to the relevant section in the chapters list below. But otherwise, let's get cracking with the best way to do form validation in JavaScript.
Okay, so let's make a start on building our form so that we can validate it later on. And what we're going to be doing is following a bit of a template that I've found online. So it's just a login form and it's got a couple of fields in here, but we're actually going to change that up a little bit and do a registration form just so it gives us a bit more flexibility to add different types of inputs. But I'm going to be sort of creating this form with this sort of sidebar and then the form on the right hand side here in HTML, and we're going to be using Tailwind for our styling just because it'll be quick and easy to get set up and add the necessary styles rather than writing a lot of CSS from scratch. So let's make a start. We're just going to actually first of all create an index page that we're going to be writing our HTML in, and this is just going to have, we'll just set a title here for JavaScript form validation, and this will be the entirety of the page. We're just going to write our form content inside of here, but we need to get set up with a couple of things first. We need to first of all install Tailwind, and we're also going to be using another library for icons as well. So we could create a build process to actually install Tailwind into our project, but because we're just going to be writing some simple HTML and JavaScript, I'm going to just use the CDN link for Tailwind, which you can find here. And this makes it really easy to just import Tailwind with a single script tag. It's not great for production because it will import everything from Tailwind, which if you've come across it before will know it's a rather large library without it being purged. So this will just get everything in here, but it'll be okay for our tutorial and we're not deploying it anywhere with the large content. So that'll take care of our styling for us. The other thing I mentioned is we're going to be using FontAwesome, the icon library, for actually displaying our icons. So we'll have a few little icons in the form and on the page itself. So we can just grab a copy of the CDN link for that from here as well and just paste that into our page. And then our page is now set up and ready to be styled with Tailwind, and we can use FontAwesome icons. Anything in this icon set here can be used within our page. The other thing I was going to mention as well is we're going to be using Live Server to preview our changes. So this is just a Visual Studio plugin called Live Server that should be installed by default. And essentially what that will enable you to do on any HTML file in your directory of your project is just to right click and then say open with Live Server, and you'll get a tab like this. So any changes that we make within our page, or indeed our JavaScript later on, will be reflected immediately as soon as the file is saved. Okay, so we're going to crack on and start coding up our page with our HTML form on it. So I'm just going to close down our navigation for the moment. And we're going to start off by creating a background image. So if you notice on the template here, It has got some kind of texture on the background, and the form stands out on the top of it. So we're going to have a look at creating that first. So what I will do for that is just create a div element and assign some classes to it, and we just make sure it's taking up full height and width of the page. And then we're going to say this is a fixed position with a top value of 0, so it's right at the top of the page. And I'm going to apply one additional class which isn't Tailwind specific, and I'm going to create some styles for that class, for the reason that this is quite tricky to do with Tailwind the way it's installed with the CDN, and we'll have a bit more control over how this particular background image is displayed. So for this background class, let's create a style tag first. So let's create a background class that we'll target with our CSS here. So the first thing we're going to do is just say the Z index is -1. So this will just push it behind all of the other content on the page, so the form that we're going to be creating. And we're going to say the background size is cover, and the background image is equal to a URL. And I have actually imported a person.jpg file into this project already. You can find your own image if you'd like to change this, but it was just something off a stock website that I was able to import into the project. So with that imported, we should find that we've got the image displaying, and I'm going to set the filter property for blur to be 6%, and that will just blur the image obviously. And then I'm going to overlay on top of this a linear gradient, because if you notice on the template, it's kind of got a pinky purple background. So we'll put something similar in here, but using a linear gradient. So we'll say linear gradient. I'm going to set an RGBA value of 0, 0, and 0.8 for the opacity. And I'll just copy that again from here. And you can see it should turn into a darkened image there, but we want to set that as a sort of pinky purpley colour. So we'll go something reasonably bright, but not too offensive. And we'll copy that RGB value onto here. So it's a gradient, but it doesn't actually go through any different colours, it's just the same colour. And there you go, we've got a sort of representation of what we have in the template as well. Okay, so with the background in place, we can start making a start on the form itself. So we're going to have a div in here, and there'll be 2 further divs. So the top one is kind of like a container, and then these are the 2 columns of the form. One being the left-hand column, which is just a hero image with some text on top of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is say the class of the container. We'll set it to be width full, but with a padding on the left and right of 8. And then we'll set a margin top of 32, just to push it down a bit there. And then we're going to set this as a flex container so that the 2 columns sit side by side. And we'll set a shadow of 2XL to give us a drop shadow. And we won't see anything in the live preview at the moment because we need some content inside the divs. So inside the first one, we're just going to put the heading level 1 tag, which has the text of hello world. And we should start to see something appearing on the page here now. And just to help that stand out a little bit as well, we'll add some classes to both of the containers, both of the columns. So width of 0.5, padding of 12, and we'll give this another class here of side column, which again isn't a Tailwind specific thing. We're going to come back to that in a second. But we'll also set a class of width of 1/2. This time we'll use padding of 16, and we'll set the background to be white, and that is for the right hand column, and that's going to be where the form is actually going to be appearing. So we're going to address this side column first, and the reason I've added this additional class here is the same reason we created the background one up here. It's just going to be easier for us to do this rather than because of the way Tailwind's been installed, to try and actually get a background image applied correctly. So for this one we're going to say the background size is going to be cover. The background position is going to be 50%, just to nudge it over to the left. And then we're going to set a similar sort of thing. We'll say the background image is equal to a URL, and it's just going to be the person.jpg image again. But we want to again put an overlay on top of that, so we'll use this linear gradient approach again, just to put a gradient over the top of the person image. but unfortunately it's going to be the same color, so we want to change that up, and we're going to change it up to a dark purple color, as it has appeared in the template as well. So we'll go for something along that line, so reasonably dark. Copy that into the second linear gradient parameter, and now you can see that standing out a bit more like it does on the page here. So obviously we can play around with those styles to get a bit more of a professional look, but we're going to crack on and create the rest of the form so we can get onto the validation. So for the actual side column, let's give the text for the hello world to be white. We want to make sure that it's a reasonable size as well. So we're going to say the text is 8XL, and then we're going to put some margin on top of that as well of 16, and finally set the font to be bold. So hopefully that looks a little bit more like it does in the template here now. And let's finish off the rest of this side column. So after the H1 tag, we're just going to have a paragraph tag in here with some filler text, which we don't need all of that. Probably just the first line of lorem ipsum would be okay. But we do want to make it white as well. So we'll say text white from here. And with that in place, actually, let's put some padding or some margin on top of that as well. So we'll say margin top and bottom is 8. And then we'll have another paragraph tag there as well. And this is going to say login with social media. But because we're going to be creating the registration form, we'll just change that up slightly and just say register with social media. Register with social media. And that text is a little bit bolder as well. So first of all, we'll set it as white. And we'll also set a margin on top and bottom of 8, and we'll set the font to be bold as well, and that should appear there. And then we're going to create those social media icons, so we'll have a couple of extra divs underneath these p tags here. So we'll create a div, and this will have a class of, change that, class of flex, and we'll put a gap of 8 in between the two items that are going to be in there, because we'll have 2 social media icons in there, and we'll create another div inside that for each of them. So for this particular, for each kind of button that we get, we'll set it to be flex, items center, and we want some gap in between the icon and the text as well, and we'll set the text to be small, just so it fits in. For the first one, it's going to be like the Facebook type login, so we'll say background blue is 900, and we'll say text white, padding left and right of 8, but also padding on top and bottom of 2, and we'll kind of set it as a rounded button, so we'll say rounded is full. And then inside of there, we're just going to say we'll put a span in here of Facebook, and to get the icon, we'll head on over to FontAwesome and just do a search here for Facebook. And we'll go for just the F there, which we can set as white, so it should hopefully stand out against that blue background. So we'll just copy that onto our clipboard and paste it into the code here. And we should see on our page, now we've got a sort of Facebook icon, and the icon's a little bit off there. I think it should be items center rather than item center. And there you go, we've got a Facebook login button there. So we can just copy this button for the next one, which is going to be a Twitter login. So all we need to really do is change a couple of the items here. So instead of having BG blue, we'll set the background to be sky of 400, which you can see looks a little bit like that. We need the Twitter icon as well, so let's find that from FontAwesome as well. So we'll say Twitter. There we go. We'll just get the bird, and it's FA Twitter, so we could just replace that from here. And then obviously change the text on the login button, or the registration button rather. And if we go back over to the page, you can see we've got our Twitter registration button there as well now. So it looks like I've added an extra div in there somewhere, so just get rid of that. And now we've finished our column on the left hand side, so that's just the display. We can actually work on the form. So let's start off by giving it a title. As mentioned, it's going to be a kind of registration form. So what we will do is put a heading level 2 tag there, which says register. And then we'll give that some classes. And the classes we want that to have are text 4XL, just to make it a bit larger obviously, and we'll set the font to be bold as well. And then after the actual heading, what we're going to do is just put a little bit of text in here. You can see on the template it says don't have an account, so create your account, but we're kind of doing the opposite. We're saying if you have got an account, then you can go and log in. So we'll just put some text that looks a bit like that. So we'll say something like already have an account. And then we'll say log in here instead. Okay. And what we'll do is just wrap that in an anchor tag. So we'll just say log in here instead. And then we'll just add some styling to this too. So for the actual P tag itself, just push it down with some margin on the top and bottom, just to give it some space around it. And then for the actual anchor tag itself, I'm just going to give it like a link looking color. So we'll just say the text blue is 700, so it looks like a link. There you go, we've got some login information if the user's already registered. So now we're at the point where we can actually put in the form. So I'm going to create a form tag here, and I'm going to give it a specific ID so we can select it in our JavaScript later on. So we'll just call it registration form. And this is where all of the inputs and labels and so forth are going to go. And what we're going to do inside of here are create form groups, which consist of basically the label, the input in question, and also any errors will be contained within that form group, and we'll update those with our JavaScript later on. So let's just create a form group to start off with. So we're going to create a div, and we'll give it a class of form group. Just so it can be selected with our JavaScript later on. We're not going to apply any special classes to it, although you could if you wish. But we also want to make sure that it's set as a flex container with columns. So we'll say flex column, and we'll just put some margin on the top and bottom as well. So let's create our first form group, and it's going to be for a name input. So we're going to create a label which just says first name. And then we're going to create an input inside of there as well, so input. And then we're going to give that the ID that matches the for property in the label so that we can click the label to access the input as well. And let's apply some classes to the input, because by default Tailwind kind of removes everything, so you can't even see the input is actually there, but it is definitely there. So we'll say it's width full, and we'll say the border bottom is 2, border black, and just remove any outline when the element is selected, and also padding of 2 on the top and bottom. So there you go, you can see the input is appearing now for first name, and we can obviously click in there and type something if we need to. So as mentioned, this form group will also contain errors as well. So we're going to create a div with a class of error so it can be selected with JavaScript, and anything inside of there will have a text red of 700 to indicate that it's an error, obviously, and some padding as well. And we won't see anything there at the moment because we need to actually insert some content with our JavaScript. What also might be nice is to show an icon if the validation for a particular field is successful, or show if there's an error. And we're going to do that with a couple of FontAwesome icons. So we're just going to add in a span here for the first one, and we're going to give it a class of error icon. Again, this isn't something Tailwind specific, this is something for us to select with our JavaScript later on. And we also want to move it in from the left, so we'll use a minus left margin of -6. And then we'll say text red is 700 just to color the icon itself. And let's go over to FontAwesome and find the exclamation. And I think there is a solid version of this as well somewhere. So we'll say circle exclamation here. So we'll copy that, and we'll pop it in the error icon class here, which you can see over here now on the page. But just to make sure that it's on the same line as the input, we're going to put this another div to capture the input and the icons at the same time. So we'll say class of flex, and then we'll say items center. And you should see that error icon now appears at the end of the input, but we're actually going to hide that because we only want to show it when the validation's gone wrong. So we'll just use the hidden class to do that. But we'll also do the same thing for a success as well. So we'll say, text green of 700, and then we should be able to find in here in FontAwesome a check circle, there should be a matching one. Yeah, so we've got circle check here. So same icon here, we'll just paste that into our success icon. So we'll change the class name of that to success icon. And we should see that on the page now. So we'll just remove the hidden class temporarily to show you that. So when the validation is good, when that's been triggered by JavaScript, we can show this success icon as well. And let's just put that hidden class back for the moment. So there we go, that is our first form input. We can literally just kind of copy and paste these groups, this form group that we've created. Of course, if we were using a framework, this is where everything would come into play by creating a component for this, but we're going to have to copy and paste this because we're just creating a standard HTML page. So we're going to first of all create another input field for email. So we'll just call it email for the input name, and the label will say input address. We can actually change the type to email as well, and that should give us another form field there. And let's copy and paste it again for another form group. After the email, we're going to have password. So the ID for that will just be password, and the label will be password. And we can change the type for that to be password so that it doesn't show the user's typing on the page. And then same again, but this time instead of password, we're going to have confirm password. So this will require the user to type in their password exactly as it was in the previous field to ensure that they've typed it in correctly. So the last thing we need to do just to finish off our form is to add a submit button. So I'm just going to create a button at the bottom of the page here, or bottom of the form, and we'll set the type to be submit. And then we'll give this a class, some classes. So if we go back to the template, we haven't looked at that for a while, you can see it's kind of like a green login button there. So we'll use the Tailwind green classes to kind of do something similar. So first of all, padding on left and right of 8, padding on top and bottom of 2, margin top of 4 just to push it down, and we'll say background green of 400. The width, we're going to set it as full. I know they've used a small button on the template, but you have a full button across the bottom of the form. And we'll say rounded is full, text white, and we'll just give it a box shadow of large. And the text inside of there, because we're doing a registration page, should just be register. So there you go, there's our form setup. We're now ready to start adding some validation. But before we start looking at the JavaScript side of things, what we're going to do is look at the built-in browser HTML validation and how you can add that using some attributes. So let's have a look at how you can trigger the inbuilt browser validation by applying HTML attributes to the input elements. So if we scroll back up here to the first input in our form, you can see we've got this first name input here, and we can actually trigger some validation for that by simply applying some HTML attributes. And the first one we'll take a look at is one called required. So say we wanted to make the first name required in this particular form, we could just save that here now, and anytime we hit the register button now, we'll see we'll get a little pop-up come from the browser, in this case Chrome, just to let us know that that field is actually required. And there are lots of other different types of attributes that we can use to control how the actual form is validated. For example, we could put something like minimum length in here. We could say the minimum length is equal to 2. And now if I go over to first name and try and put in a single character, you'll see that we get another message saying that we need to put more additional characters into that input for it to be validated. And again, the form hasn't been submitted. So we should probably do this anyway because we want to make sure our validation is in place even if JavaScript isn't running, if it's been disabled for some reason. So we do the exact same thing in JavaScript by first of all getting a reference to the input element. So for example, if we say first name is equal to document.getElementById, first name, and then we could get its value just by checking the first name element that we've selected and just get its value here. And we could say is the value equal to an empty string, and if the first name input value is an empty string, then we can push an error somewhere. So example, if we had an array of errors, and we could just push first name is required. So we could write something like that and then render that out into our error class that we've got down here, our error div. So that would be the way that most people would approach doing some JavaScript form validation. But wouldn't it be good if we could actually look at this particular input and see what attributes have been applied to it, such as required or min length, and then write out some error message depending on what validation rules haven't actually been met? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be doing in our JavaScript code, and by doing so, we'll be examining each input in turn, and we won't be actually depending on finding out the IDs, for example, of each of the inputs. We can just take each input that's actually inside of the form and then grab the attributes that are assigned to it, such as required or min length, and then run validation in our JavaScript accordingly. So the first thing we'll want to do is actually get the script loaded onto our page, because this script.js file won't do anything at the moment. It's not in our index. So let's just go to the bottom of the page. Just before our body tag closes, we'll say script source, and then we've got script.js. So our first job really is to set up a function that will accept a form, and then we can start working through the different inputs that are in the form. And the way I'm going to do that in our JavaScript is to create a function called validate form. And what I will pass into that is one single argument, which will be a selector, and it will be the selector to find the form within the document. So we'll actually create a variable inside the function called form element, and this will reference the overall form HTML element, and we'll just do a quick call to document query selector based on the form selector that's passed in. So the way we would use this is we would say if we want to validate the form that's on our existing page, we would say validate form, and then the reference to it, if you remember when we created the form, is just, where's the form? Down here of a registration form. So it's got an ID, so we'll just pass in a hash registration form, and now when that runs, we will get the form element stored in this variable. So on that form element, I'm going to do two things. The first is I'm going to actually add an attribute. So I'm going to say form element dot set attribute. And the attribute I'm actually going to set is one called no validate, which, as the name might suggest to you, what this will do is it will actually disable the HTML validation that we just saw a moment ago, because we don't want that running at the same time as our own custom JavaScript validation as well. And just to stop the form from completely submitting as well, because it'll actually reload the page, on that form element, I'm going to add an event listener. And it will be an event listener for submit. And what will happen, we'll get the event object inside of there. So when the event is triggered, when the submit event is triggered, we're just going to say event.prevent default. And we should find now, even though we've got the required HTML attribute on this first name property, if I hit register, I'm clicking the button now, the inbuilt browser validation doesn't trigger, and also the form doesn't submit as well. So we're now in a position where we can start applying our own validation via our JavaScript. I'm going to do that by creating a couple of functions, and the first is going to be validate all form groups. And this is a function that is going to basically accept a particular form to validate, and the form to validate is obviously going to be the form element that we've got, so we can actually add that into our event listener. So we're going to trigger this function once the user has clicked the register button and submitted the form. So the first thing I want to do is actually grab all of the form groups out of the actual form itself. So where we've got these divs that have got form groups as a class, and they've got labels, and they've got the inputs and the errors containers inside there, we want to actually get those and store them in an array. So we're going to do that by saying we're going to get a new variable called form groups, and we're going to generate an array from the result of the form to validate, and we're going to say query selector all, and the name of the form is just the name of the form groups class is just form group. So I'm just converting the result of query selector all, which will actually return a node list, into a specific JavaScript array. So what we'll have in this form groups variable now is just an array of each of these form groups that in turn contains the labels and inputs and so forth. So for each of those form groups, we're just going to say we want to validate them. And I'm going to do that by looping through each of them and then just calling a function called validate single form group. And I will pass in that form group that has just been looped through from our query selector. Okay, so we haven't created this function yet, obviously. So I'm just going to do that up here. So this is the kind of setup for the form, but up here are going to be the functions that will help us to make a reusable code to validate the actual form itself. So let's create that function, validate single form group, and we'll get a form group argument passed in, and we'll open up an arrow function here. So this function's got the job of actually checking the form group and seeing if it's actually going to meet the validation criteria that have been applied in the HTML markup. But first of all, we need to get references to all of the elements. But because we've got the actual form group itself, we don't need to do a document query selector. We can actually query selector on the form group itself. So we'll say form group query selector label. So that will get us the label element, obviously. The next one is going to be the input. So we can actually do a query selector on input, and we can put anything else in here as well. So for example, if we're using text areas in our form as well, you can do a selector on those as well, and it'll just give you whatever has been applied in that particular form group, but we're only using inputs in this particular form. And we want to get a reference to the error container. So form group.query selector, and that had a class of error, which is the div that's we're going to put our error message inside. And then we want to get two other items as well, and the first is going to be the error icon. So we'll say a variable called error icon, and we'll use the selector for the class of error icon. And we'll say success icon. So this will come into play later on when we want to actually hide and show those particular icons, depending on whether the validation was true or not. So this function has all of the information, it has all of the elements that we need within a particular form group, but we need a way to check each of the inputs to actually see if it's got one of the attributes, such as required in the HTML markup, before we actually start running any validation. So again, we could do something like if input value is equal to something, then we do trigger some validation if it's not right. But this isn't a very maintainable way of doing it, because we're going to have a huge list of if statements and if and else, and it can get a little bit messy. So probably a better way to do it is to create some validation options, some rules that will loop through, and then we'll check the input against each of those rules and trigger an error message if it breaks that particular rule. So we'll close that for the moment. So we'll come back to this validate single form group function in a moment, but I'm going to create an array up here called validation options, and this the items in this array will be objects, and they'll have three properties. The first is going to be the attribute that we want to check for, so it could be something like required, for example. The next property is going to be is the actual value inside of the input valid according to this attribute, and we're going to do that by creating a function which will receive the actual input itself, or we could pass in the input value if we wanted to, but let's pass in the whole input, and then we're going to return a true or false value depending on whether the input value is meeting the attribute of required. So for example, for required, we want to actually check whether or not there is actually some content in the input itself. So we're going to say input.value.trim, so we just remove any white space from that. So if the actual string that's inside of there is not an empty string, then we will actually return true. But if we do receive an empty string, then this will be false, and then we can trigger our error message down here in the validate single form group function. The other thing is we want to make that error message dynamic based on the actual field that we're looking at, and we could take a property off the input like the ID or something like that, but we'll get a nasty sort of camel cased version of the actual label. So we can actually pass in the label to another function on a property which we're going to call error message. So again, this will be another function which will return a string, and we're going to pass in the input and also the label elements that we've got down here in the validate single form group function. And as I say, this will just be a template literal which will represent the error, and we'll get the label.text content. So if we look at the markup quickly, we'll see That will be this label here, for example, for first name. So we'll get this content that's inside of here. So it'll match what the user sees on the page. So hopefully it will make exact sense as to what field has actually failed validation. So the label.text content is required, is going to be the error message that we're going to return if the isValid function returns false. So if all that doesn't really make too much sense, it soon will do as we fill out the rest of the validate single form group function. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of those validation options. So we're going to say for const of option of validation options. We're just going to loop through everything that's inside of this array up here. And the first thing we're going to do is check if the input that we're currently looking at in this form group actually has that particular attribute. So we'll have an if statement here and we'll say if the input element that we've got has the attribute, and which attribute are we going to be checking for? Well, we're going to be checking for each attribute that's inside of these validation options here. So if input attribute has option.attribute, and we're also going to run the isValid function that's inside of the option. So we'll say if it's not valid, so if option is valid, and pass in the input element that we've extracted in the form group, then we know at this point we've got an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference the error container, which is the error div on the page within the form group. So that error container dot text content is going to be equal to the option dot error message. So that function will take in the input and also the label. Okay. So at this point we will have some working validation which we can test out in the browser. So what's going to happen when we click the submit button is that we will actually validate all the form groups, which in turn will run this function for each of the form groups inside of the form. And if at the moment we're only checking for required attributes, but if we find one, we'll put an error message if the if the input doesn't actually have any text in it. So let's test that out by clicking register. And you can see here we've got first name is required, and that error message is being generated from our function and being put into the error container, which is on the page. So if all that looks like a lot of work, let me show you something really powerful now. So we go over to our index.html page, which has got our form on it. And let's say we now want to make sure that the email address is required as well. So we just apply the required attribute to the actual input that is accepting our email. And now if we click register, you can see that we're getting an error message for the email address as well, because we've now specified in our markup that the email address is required too. So if you remember right at the start of the video, I said we don't want our validation rules in two places. Here we're keeping all of our validation information inside of the input in the HTML so that it will work with either the HTML browser validation or our custom JavaScript validation that we're putting on top of that. Of course, if we do fill something out at the moment and click register again, it's still going to give us the same error message, simply because we're not clearing the error messages if we get a valid response. So we may get more than one validation problem for each of the inputs if we've got multiple validation rules on there. So what I'm going to do before we start this loop here, I'm just going to say let form group error equals false. And if we do get an error, what I will do is I will say the form group error variable is set as true. And then we'll just have another if statement after the for loop has finished. And we'll say if not a form group error, if there's no errors been occurred, then what we can do is just set the error container dot text content equal to an empty string. So what we should find now is if we click the register button, obviously those two fields are required, but as soon as we put something in there and click register, then that error message goes away. Okay, so we've only created the one validation option for required at the moment, and we're going to come on to the handling of other different types of validation in just a moment. But before we move on, let's actually add some more styling to the inputs when they actually are invalid or valid. So let's just go inside of here. So we know we've got an error occurred here. So what we're going to do is say on the input, we're going to add the class list I'm going to add a class to the actual input, and we're going to say the border red is 700. And if there are no errors occurring, then obviously we're setting the text content for the errors to be empty, but we'll actually set the border to be green as well, just to give a visual indication that it's been validated okay. So we just want the converse of those as well. So we want to, if there is an error, we want to remove any green borders on there. And if the errors have all gone, we want to remove any red borders. Just so we've got no clashes on the inputs themselves, and we get the correct coloured border. The other thing we want to do is the icons as well. So for this success icon, we want to make sure that it's hidden. So class list for success icon, we want to make sure it's hidden if there is an error. But of course, if the error icon, we want to remove that class to show it. So remove icon, class list dot remove hidden, and just the same for if there is no errors, if it's been validated successfully, except we just want to mix that up. So we'll remove any hidden classes from the success icon to show it, and we'll add the hidden icon to the error icon. And I've just noticed I've put remove instead of error for some reason there. So error icon and error icon here. Okay, we'll save that. So let's click register again one more time. So you can see now we've got the email address and the first name are invalid because they're required. These two are still valid because we haven't added any validation rules to password or confirm password. But if we just fill something out on first name, you can see that now changes to a green tick and it's all good. So as mentioned, we're going to add the rest of the validation rules as well. So as it stands at the moment, I think the first name we said would have a min length of 2, but obviously if we put in just a single character at the moment, it still validates okay, so that's not working. And we just need to go in and create the validation option rules inside this array. So when this function is called and we loop through the different validation options, we're checking for minimum length. So what does that look like with our validation options? Well, we're going to create an object in exactly the same way, and we're going to be checking for the min length attribute this time, and we'll create another isValid function as well. So we're going to take the input value again in exactly the same way based on this code that's down here. And with the input, we're going to check it's got a value to start off with, because if it hasn't got a value, we don't want to be trying to access its length property. But we'll say if the input has got a value that's inside there, we'll say the input value.length bigger than or equal to a certain value. So how are we going to get the value for min length? Well, obviously we could hard code this, but that leaves us with an unflexible function again. So what we can do is actually get the value that's stored inside this attribute here, the min length property, and compare the value that's inside of value.length with that min length property. So this is a little bit funny in JavaScript because with the input you'd expect to be able to get the min length property in this sort of way, but it's actually camel cased. So we've got min length is the actual proper value that represents the value that's stored inside of the attribute, and we should of course make sure that we're actually converting it to an integer as well because it comes back as a string. So we'll say parseInt input.minLength and then make sure it's base 10. So that's our isValid function for min length. We're just checking the value and the length that is actually bigger than the min length property that's set in the markup. So let's do our error message function as well. So we'll take the input and the label, and this time we're going to say template literal, and we'll get the text inside of the label again. We'll say it needs to be at least, and then we'll just access input.minLength again, min length characters. Okay, so let's try that again, and if we click register this time, we'll see we get this error message saying that the first name needs to be at least 2 characters, and if we put more than 2 characters into there, obviously the error message goes away, but we might want to actually trigger the required attribute validation first, before we show the user the 2 characters error message. That's just a simple matter of, in our array, putting things in order as to how you want them to appear. So we'll check for min length first, but then we'll check for required, and if required is actually present, it will override the min length error message and display that instead. So you can see now we'll get first name is required, put in a single character, you can see that we get the error message first name needs to be at least 2 characters. So you might want to do validation on max length as well, but this is a little bit tricky, and I'll show you why. So we'll put in here a value for max length, and we'll just say max length of the first name is 5. And we can't do this in the same way that we did with the min length property, because when we actually start typing into the box here, the actual browser, the form control itself, won't actually let me type more than 5 characters because of this particular property here. So what we're going to need to do a max length validation is to say custom max length, so creating our own attribute essentially, and then we should be able to still be able to type more characters than necessary into there, but then we can create a new validation option based on that particular attribute. So we're going to create a new one here saying attribute custom max length, and we're going to create an isValid function which will take the input again, and this is going to be exactly the same as the min length one but just in reverse. So first of all we'll check for a value, and then we'll say input.value.length has got to be less than or equal to, and then it'll be parse int and then input dot, and this time because it's a custom attribute we need to use the get attribute function. So we'll say input.get attribute custom max length. Just make sure we're using base 10 for that. So same thing, just in reverse for the max length property there. And then we want to put in our error message as well, which again is a function with the input and the label. And we'll return a template literal and say the label.text content needs to be less than, and then we'll say using the input we're going to get the attribute again for custom max length, and then just say characters on the end there. So now what we should find is that custom max length attribute, if that's present on any of our inputs, it will actually trigger an error if we go above that value. So you can see here first name needs to be less than 5 characters. So what about the email address field? We want to make sure it's required, but we might want to also check that what the user is entering looks a bit like an email address. So if we click register now, then that's fine. We get the validation passing, but as you can see, that is not an email address that the user's entered. So the way we could achieve this within our code at the moment is by using the pattern validation property within the HTML input. So if we scroll down here to the email address, so we can apply a pattern. This is a valid HTML attribute, and it's saying that basically this input that's inside of whatever the user types into this field should match a particular regular expression pattern. So we could use a really simple expression to match for email addresses. So we could say we get any character and then the @ symbol, and then we get any character, and then that's the end of the string. So this isn't a very good pattern for matching email addresses, but it will just work for our example here. You could obviously use something a bit more robust if you wanted to use this in your own code. But with that in place, all we need to do now is actually go back to the script and write another custom validation option for matching the attributes of pattern. So down here, let's just create another entry into the array, and we're going to be looking for the pattern attribute. And then what we can do here for the isValid function that we need to check the input value. This time, instead of actually checking the value inside there based on its length or anything, we can actually create a new regular expression to check it on. So we'll say the pattern regex is going to be equal to a new regular expression object, and it's going to have be extracted from input.pattern, which is where we just set up the pattern a moment ago in the HTML markup. So with our pattern regex, we can just say pattern regex dot test, and then we're going to provide it with the value that's inside of the input. So we'll say input dot value. So if that passes, if the regular expression is matched with the input value that the user typed in, we'll get a true response back, and then that isValid function will return true. So then when we come to generate the error, we'll say error message function, or the property rather, is a function that takes the input and the label again. So we'll generate another template literal to put onto the form. So the template literal we're going to return is slightly different because we don't really understand what context this pattern's been applied in. You can obviously see from the markup that it's an email address, so we could say something like not valid, and then we'll use label.text content, which should give us the message that it's not a valid email address, and just test out that pattern in there. So you can say not valid email address. But obviously you might want to customize this depending on what sort of pattern you're matching on, but it should work for 99% of the cases as long as the label makes sense as to what you're typing in reference to the pattern. Okay, so we've seen how to do quite a lot of different types of validation based on the attributes that are available to us already. Let's just go and add a few more into the password and confirm password boxes. So we could say something like they're required, and probably the min length for a password should be 8 or something like that. And the same sort of thing for the confirm password as well. So let's just run the validation for those. So you can see here that they both need to be at least 8 characters. But one thing that's really common with a confirm password box is that it needs to match the value that's inside of password, because otherwise the whole idea of the confirm password is that you've typed in the same password twice. So this is a little bit more tricky to do with our code that we've got, but it is achievable, and there aren't any built-in HTML attributes that will do this for you, so it is a case of creating something custom again, in a very similar way to the custom max length that we did. So for confirm password, what we're going to do is we're going to put a custom attribute onto this, and the custom attribute will just say match. So it's going to be the ID of the HTML input that we want to match. So that, in our case, that's going to be password. So we'll just save that. And now we're in a position where we can write another validation option to test for that match attribute if we find it. So let's set that up now. So we'll say the attribute is match. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but the isValid function is going to be taking the input yet again. And this function, we need to actually find the value, the selector value that's inside of the match attribute. So we'll say new const of match selector is input.get attribute match, and that should hold password in our example for the confirm password box. And then we need to actually match the element. So we'll say the matched element, is going to be equal to the document.query selector, and then we'll just use template literal for the ID and the match selector. Of course, you could restrict this to the form element as well. That probably makes a bit more sense rather than querying the whole document. So we'll only find the ID, missed out a dollar sign there. We'll only find the selector of the matched element that's inside of the form. Okay, so we've got the element now, so we know which element the confirm password box in this example should match up to, and all we need to do is just check that the values are actually the same. So for the matched element, so this will be the original password element, if we find that and the matched element dot value, and we'll trim any white space off that as well, is equal to the input dot value dot trim again. Then we know that those two values are the same, those two strings match, and so we can return true. If they don't match, then obviously we'll return false and trigger the validation. So let's create the function for the error message here. So it will be function of input and value, input and label are passed in again. And then from there, we need to do a similar thing. We need to get the matched element again, so we'll just copy those 2 lines of code here. And we also want to find the matched label as well. So this is a bit more tricky than it sounds. So when we've got the matched element, that would be here, the password element. But to get the label, we actually need to go to the parent element, which is this div here, and then the parent element again, which is this div here, and then we can actually grab that element from inside of that. So that looks a little bit like this. So the matched label is equal to the matched element dot parent element, and then again going up another level, the parent element, and then we'll do a query selector for label. So once we've got the label, we can generate a decent error message. So we'll say label dot text content should match, and then we've got the matched label, so we can say the matched label dot text content So the error will basically say that the current input element that's got the match attribute on it should match the other element and grab its label. So let's just run that now. So we should just get confirm password is required. So if we type something in there, confirm password is still required, but if I put something slightly different in confirm password, we should get the error message saying that the confirm password should match password, and we've got something undefined here. Totally misspelled how to spell content there, so it's content. There we go, that's better. Let's try that again. So put something in longer for confirm password. So here you go, we can see that password needs to be at least 8 characters, but confirm password should also match password. So that's just an example how you can create your own custom matching validation with our validation option rules, and just by providing the function to check whether it's valid, and also the error message function as well. So that's all of the validation options I'm going to go through in the tutorial, but hopefully you can see that you can create anything that you like in here, as long as you provide the attribute in the markup, and then provide an isValid, an error message function just to check the value of the input and then generate an error message if something goes wrong. This code down here that does the validation doesn't change, which makes it incredibly reusable, and you just need to put in your own validation options if you want to create something a bit more custom. One final thing before we finish up, at the moment our form only validates when we click the register button, but you might want some more immediate feedback for the user, so you might want to trigger the validation as the user is going through the form and filling out each input bit by bit. So because of the way we've created our code, this is super easy. We don't need to create anything in addition to what we've got, other than another function that runs on an event in the form that's fired. And there are different events that you can listen to, but probably a good one is to listen to the blur event. So that's basically triggered when the user's navigating from one field to the next. So going from one field input to the next will generate a blur event, and what we can do is just trigger validate single form group function here each time the blur event is fired. So let's just close that up so that we can create a new event listener down here. So we'll need to set up an event for each of the input elements on the page, and we can get those quite easily from the form that's been passed in, the form element that we've got. So on the form element that we've selected at the start of our function, we can just access its elements property, and that will give us, this code will give us an array of all of the inputs that are within the form. And then so for each of those, so we'll say for each element, we can then just set up an event listener. So we'll say element dot add event listener. And as mentioned, we're going to listen for the blur event, or it could be something else. You could put the key down event if you wanted to, or update perhaps. And we'll grab the event object, and the event object will actually tell us which element has triggered the blur event. So we're just going to say call the validate single form group function, and we need to do a bit of trickery again here like we did with the matching error messages and functions. So we're going to grab from the event the source element, but because the actual input element is kind of nested in the form group, we need to go to the parent element and then to the parent element again. So we'll say source element dot parent element dot parent element, and that will actually pass in the form group to the validate single form group function, which is exactly what it needs. So if we save that, going back to the form, if we go and fill in the or don't fill in the first name, we should see that that validation is triggered straight away. And if we go to the email address and navigate to the next input after that, we trigger that element validation. So that blur event is being fired and the validation is being triggered. And so that'll update dynamically as the user types. So when we type something invalid, obviously it updates. And let's just put in some email address into here. Password 123, nice and secure. Password 123 for confirm password. So you can see you can give some immediate feedback to the user as they go through the form and fill in each form in turn. And of course, making any changes will cause the validation to still trigger. So hopefully you'll agree with me that that is a much better way to validate forms in JavaScript. And of course, you could just pick up this code, drop it onto another page, and assuming you pass in the correct selector for the form and you have the form structured in the same way as we have here, it will do the same validation. You don't need to worry about creating even more JavaScript to actually go in and update, select all of the different input elements and check their values. Of course, within your sites and your apps, you shouldn't just rely on front-end JavaScript to validate that a form has been entered incorrectly. So make sure you check out this next video where we look at how to validate form inputs in a Node.js app using the Joy library to make sure that the data that the user's passing in from the front end is actually matching the data that you require for your app.